All right, so let's jump right into it. Today, we're talking about the progressive era. Now, you got to picture this. It's the turn of the 20th century. America's booming with incredible new inventions and cities that are scraping the sky. But there's a dark side, a really dark side. The country was facing some huge, dangerous problems. So what happened? Well, millions of people basically stood up and said, enough is enough. It's time to make a real change. Let's get into how they tried to fix a nation that felt like it was about to break.
Okay, so here's the game plan. First, we're going to look at the problems that kicked this whole thing off. Then, we'll check out their actual blueprint for reform. What was the plan? After that, we'll see how change started small in cities and states before exploding onto the national stage and into the White House. And finally, we have to talk about the parts they missed, the movement's big blind spots, and figure out what it all means for us today.
So, to really get what the progressives were all about, you first have to know what they were up against. You know, we hear about the Gilded Age and think of incredible growth and wealth, but it wasn't all shiny and new. It's like it cast this huge dark shadow over the country, creating these massive problems that honestly felt like they were ripping the nation apart at the seams.
And yeah, this list, it really shows you just how bad things were. I mean, just think about this for a second. You had corrupt party bosses running whole cities like their own personal piggy banks. The food you bought, the medicine, it could literally be dangerous, even deadly. Kids were working in just brutal, awful conditions. And to top it all off, you had these giant monopolies, they called them trusts, that controlled, get this, 80% of all U.S. industries. 80%. They were crushing any kind of competition and creating this insane gap between the super rich and, well, pretty much everybody else.
So you might be wondering, how did regular people even find out about all this stuff? Well, that's where a new kind of hero comes in. Investigative journalists. They got this nickname muckrakers, and they were fearless. People like Ida M. Tarbell. She wrote these absolutely explosive articles exposing the shady deals of big business and how they were in bed with the government. They were bringing the ugly truth right into people's homes.
But here's the key thing. The progressives weren't just about pointing out all the problems. That's easy, right? No, they were organizers. They had a real plan. They got together and came up with a clear set of goals to try and fix what they saw as a totally broken society. This wasn't just a bunch of random angry people. It was a coordinated blueprint for reform.
And this right here, this is their four-part playbook. First up, protecting social welfare. They saw the awful conditions in the cities and wanted to help. You had groups like the Salvation Army and reformers fighting to get kids out of dangerous factories. Second, promoting moral improvement. Some progressives felt the country was losing its way, so they pushed for things like prohibition. Third, creating economic reform. This was a big one. They went after the massive power of big business and the huge inequality of capitalism. Some folks even started talking about socialism. And finally, fostering efficiency. The idea here was to use science and logic to make everything better and less wasteful, from how a factory was run to how the government operated.
And what's so important to remember is that this huge wave of change didn't start in Washington, D.C. Nope, it started from the ground up. It began in cities and states, with regular citizens getting organized to take back power from the corrupt politicians and the giant companies that basically own them.
Yeah, at the state level, this movement really caught fire. You had these progressive governors like Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, they called him Fighting Bob, who became national heroes for taking on the powerful railroad industry. States started passing actual laws to protect workers, banning child labor and limiting work hours. And they did something that sounds simple to us, but was a game changer: the secret ballot. Before that, your boss or a political thug could literally stand over your shoulder while you voted. The secret ballot was a massive step in stopping that kind of intimidation.
And to give people even more direct power, reformers came up with some really clever tools. The first one was the initiative. Okay, so think of it like this. Let's say your state politicians are in the pocket of some big company and refuse to pass a law that everyone wants. With the initiative, citizens could just go around them. They could write the law themselves, get enough signatures, and put it directly on the ballot for everyone to vote on. Power to the people, literally.
Next up, you have the referendum. This one is kind of like a public veto. So the politicians pass a law, but maybe the people don't like it. The referendum gives voters the final say. They can vote to either approve it or throw it out. When you put the initiative and the referendum together, you can see how it was a huge shift in power, moving it away from the politicians and back to the voters.
And the last one in this toolkit was the recall. Man, this was the ultimate accountability tool. Think of it as the public's "you're fired" button. If an elected official was corrupt or just wasn't doing their job, citizens could collect signatures and force a special election to kick them out of office early. It sent a really clear message. We're watching you.
So all this energy, all these reforms happening in the states, it all built up to something huge, a change to the U.S. Constitution itself. Now before this, U.S. senators weren't elected by the people. They were picked by politicians in the state legislature, which, as you can imagine, was just a recipe for corruption and backroom deals. The 17th Amendment changed all that. It gave the power to elect senators directly to the voters where it should have been all along.
Okay, so with all this momentum building from the ground up, it was pretty much inevitable that the progressive movement would eventually reach the White House. And it did. For about 20 years straight, you had 3 presidents in a row, all very different guys who pushed the progressive agenda forward from the most powerful office in the country.
So first we have the one and only Theodore Roosevelt, starting in 1901. He's followed by the guy he chose to replace him, William Howard Taft. And then things get really interesting, and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson wins a crazy 3-way election. Roosevelt became famous as the trust buster. Now, he wasn't against big business in general. His whole thing was that when a company got so big it became a harmful monopoly that crushed all competition and hurt regular people, the government had to step in. And step in he did. His administration filed 44 antitrust lawsuits against these corporate giants to try and bring back some fairness to the marketplace. And Roosevelt also used the power of the presidency to protect consumers. There was this shocking novel, The Jungle, by Upton Sinclair, that exposed the absolutely disgusting, filthy conditions in the meatpacking industry. I mean, people read it and were horrified. Roosevelt was too, and he pushed Congress hard to pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. He was also a huge conservationist, setting aside a mind-blowing 148 million acres for forest reserves and national parks. Okay, and this is where the political drama really heats up. So Roosevelt leaves, and his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, takes over. And get this, Taft actually busted more trusts than Roosevelt did, 90 of them. But his political style was just different. He was more cautious, more conservative, and he ended up really ticking off the progressive wing of the Republican Party. It got so bad that Roosevelt himself came back and challenged Taft for the nomination. When he lost, he created his own party, the Bull Moose Party, and ran anyway, splitting the vote. So with the Republicans basically at war with each other, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, just waltzes right into the White House. He came in with his own agenda called the New Freedom, and it was all about big-time economic reforms. He strengthened the laws against monopolies, he created the Federal Trade Commission, which is basically a corporate watchdog agency that still exists today, and he set up the Federal Reserve System to get a handle on the nation's banking system and money supply. But we have to be honest here. For all the good things that happened, the progressive movement had some massive, glaring blind spots. It was an unfinished revolution. And when you look at how it dealt with the rights of women, and especially the rights of African Americans, well, the story gets a lot more complicated, and frankly, a lot more disappointing. The fight for women to get the right to vote was just an incredibly long and difficult struggle. It wasn't an easy win. As you can see, they had this multi-pronged strategy. They fought for it state by state, they took their case to the courts, and they never, ever stopped pushing for a national amendment to the Constitution. It took decades of tireless work, but finally, after women played such a crucial role on the home front during World War I, the tide turned. In 1920, they won. The 19th Amendment was passed. When it comes to African Americans, though, the progressive era was just a total failure. The movement, for the most part, completely ignored the issue of civil rights. In fact, for Black Americans, things were actually getting worse. The Supreme Court had handed down this terrible decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which made separate but equal the law of the land, and that was just legal cover for segregation and all the brutal Jim Crow laws in the South. So, in the face of all this, you had 2 powerful voices emerge in the Black community with 2 very different ideas about how to fight back. On one hand, you had Booker T. Washington. He argued for a slower, more gradual approach, that Black Americans should focus on learning skills and proving their economic value, and that respect would come eventually. But then you had W.E.B. Du Bois, who was like, absolutely not. He demanded full social and economic equality right now. He co-founded the NAACP specifically to fight for civil rights in the courts. And it's just a harsh reality that the so-called progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, did next to nothing to help. So, when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway from this era? Well, the progressives completely redefined the role of government in American life. Before them, the idea was mostly hands-off. But they championed a new idea,
that the government could, and in fact should, be an active player in fixing society's biggest problems.
And that really leaves us with the exact same question that drove their entire movement, a question we are still arguing about every single day. What should the government's role be in solving our problems? The progressives gave their answer, a really bold one for their time. And by doing that, they basically set the stage for the political debates we're still having, right now, over 100 years later.